All right, good morning, guys. Say it. All right, like I said, we're gonna jump into chapter 16. We're gonna skip 15 and go to chapter 16. I'm gonna give basically a section of notes every day this week. You'll have one assignment for chapter 16, and then your chapter test will be on Friday. So we're gonna try to cover chapter 16 and 17 in the next 2 weeks. So we may be kind of moving pretty quickly. But these next couple of weeks, we're just going to do it like we do at school. I'll present the notes. You'll just need pen and paper, whatever. Write these notes down, and then you can use those for your test on Fridays. Don't forget about your photo essay. Be working on that and get that turned in. I think I put it due on Friday, so make sure you get that done as well. All right, as we jump into chapter 16 here, we're basically going to be dealing with the issue of slavery. And we've been dealing with this issue for several years, okay? Anytime we talk about statehood for a certain state, it always goes back to slavery. Is that state going to be a free state? Is that state going to be a slave state? And so we'll see the problems that will cause. And then by the end of this chapter, like I said, we'll see just how the issue is. It becomes such an issue that it will actually lead us into our American Civil War. Okay, but slavery had been an issue for really ever since it started. When the first slave ship came over from Africa to Jamestown, the first African slaves arrived in Jamestown in like 1619. People thought, is it right to own another human being? So the question of slavery had been issued. It had been debated in the United States for a very long time. If you remember back, we talked about the Missouri Compromise back around 1820 when Missouri wanted to become a state. Okay, well, it wanted to become a slave state. We needed a free state to come in with it so that the balance of power in the Senate would be equal. You can't have one more than the other because now the balance of power is upset, and whatever group has the more votes obviously is going to get their legislation passed. So if you remember the Missouri Compromise, Missouri comes in as a slave state, sorry. Maine will join the Union as a free state. But they also, if you remember, decided that the Louisiana Territory, all the land in the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 parallel would be closed to slavery in the future. So from that line that I showed you in the map, if you remember, anything north of that in the Louisiana Territory, slavery was off limits. Okay, and we're going to see how that's going to be a problem here in just a little bit. Another issue, obviously we've talked about the Mexican War, but another issue was what are we going to do with land that we acquire from other groups? And a lot of that was from Mexico. If you remember, in 1845, Texas is annexed. Well, is Texas going to become a slave state or a free state? Remember, we talked about the Mexican War, the land that we received from that, the Mexican Cession, and also California. What are we going to do with those states or those areas? Is there going to be slavery? Is there not going to be slavery? And that's going to lead to certain other compromises, one of which we've talked about, but we'll just kind of discuss it briefly again, trying to figure out what we're going to do with the issue of slavery. Shortly after the Mexican War started, a man named David Wilmot proposes what was called the Wilmot Proviso. He says any lands that we might acquire from Mexico after this war is over, we should ban slavery in any of those lands, which would have been the entire Mexican Cession, basically the entire southwestern United States today. We didn't necessarily acquire California from Mexico. Remember, they became independent and then we will annex them, and they will eventually become a state. But that's a different issue. Okay, so David Wilmot says, any lands that we get from Mexico, let's ban slavery in those territories in that section. Well, obviously, southern states are opposed to that. And so you've got a man named John C. Calhoun. David Wilmot's there in the top, Calhoun's down at the bottom. He really looks like a character from a creepy movie or something. But South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun comes out and says that Congress nor any territorial government can ban or basically regulate slavery. So both of these guys are going to pass these bills. Wilmot will pass the Wilmot Proviso bill saying let's ban slavery in all territory from Mexico. John Calhoun says Congress, no government, nobody can ban slavery in any territory or regulate slavery in any territory. So they both pass these bills. It will become very heated in Congress. Neither of these bills will pass. So there's still this issue. What are we going to do with those territories once they become part of the United States? And we'll get to what the United States decides to do here in just a minute. All right, so we're going to have an election of 1848. In 44, Polk had been president. He's the one that acquires a lot of these lands from Mexico eventually. 1848, we're going to have another election. The Whigs, who we've talked about, will nominate a man named Zachary Taylor. And I'll have pictures of these guys here in just a minute. Just for some reason, they don't pop up when I pull them up there. The Democrats will nominate a man from Michigan named Lewis Cass. And so these are going to be your two major political party candidates in the election of 1848. Well, the biggest issue in 1848 is obviously slavery. Neither of these candidates are going to address the issue of slavery in their while they're campaigning. They both kind of just ignore it, and maybe they're thinking maybe it'll go away. But obviously, this is the major issue of the time. Well, both of these candidates just kind of ignore it. So a third political party is going to come out of this because a lot of the pro or the anti-slavery members are going to leave their parties. I mean, there were some Democrats that did not agree with slavery. So some anti-slavery Whigs, some anti-slavery Democrats are going to come together to form another political party called the Free Soil Party. And their slogan that they came up with was free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Meaning we have all this land. You have the right to free speech, give your opinions. You can work, do whatever you want to do, and everybody should be free as well. Well, their candidate is going to be a former president, Martin Van Buren. That's not Martin Van Buren. Up in the top left is Taylor, then Cass over here in the bottom right, and then you remember Martin Van Buren there in the bottom left. Him and his crazy hair there. Martin Van Buren won't play a huge role in the election. The Free Soil Party will win some seats in Congress. But after the election, the Whig, Zachary Taylor, will be elected president in 1848. He's going to die unexpectedly in office. And so his vice president, Millard Fillmore, will take over for him after he passes away. Southerners are becoming more and more concerned over growing abolitionism. Abolitionism, trying to abolish slavery, trying to do away with slavery. Remember, this is the Southern way of life. These slaves working on the farms, working on the plantations. So these Southerners are becoming concerned over the rise of abolitionism. And they think they're trying to end their way of life. And we talked about some of the things that they were concerned with. One, California wanting to become a free state. In 1849, we talked about that a little bit. Some anti-slavery groups want to ban slavery in Washington, D.C. And so some of these things that the South is hearing is making them concerned. So even in 1849, 1850, the South starts to talk of secession or seceding from the Union, to break away from the Union. Eventually they will, but 1850, 1849 is when they're really starting to think, maybe we should just break away, become our own nation. We can have slavery. We can, pass our own laws. We can do the things that we want to do. We can preserve our way of life without the North or without these abolitionists trying to tell us what we can and cannot do. Well, in order to try and preserve the Union, okay, we've already talked about what happened. Henry Clay, also known as the Great Compromiser, proposes the Compromise of 1850, which we have talked about. You don't have to write those parts of the Compromise of 1850 down again, but he will propose, that California become a free state. When he divided the Mexican cession into the Utah and New Mexico territories, slavery in those areas would be determined by popular sovereignty. The slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., not slavery, but the slave trade. It set a border for Texas, Mexico. You remember all those things that we talked about. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at in this issue of slavery here in 1850 with the passing of the Compromise of 1850. And I just got to say this, Henry Clay kind of looks like a human form of the Grinch. So just thought I'd throw that out there for you. All right, last thing here. Talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to be proposed by a man named Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois. Let me back up. The first time we see Stephen Douglas is with the Compromise of 1850. That compromise was debated quite a bit in Congress. So Stephen Douglas came up with a plan to take each individual aspect of the Compromise of 1850 and have the people vote on it individually. By doing so, they were able to get the things passed that they needed to pass in order to help preserve the Union. Okay, so that's where we kind of first see Stephen Douglas in helping get the Compromise of 1850 passed. When 1854, or prior to 1854, he's going to propose what was known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what that was, sorry, I'm going to go back. He basically wanted to organize the territories west of Missouri, so really the remaining area of what we know as the Louisiana Territory. He wanted to organize that into two territories, the territory of Kansas and the territory of Nebraska. And so he's going to take the rest of that land. Let's make two separate territories out of it, and we'll go from there. Okay. He wants to implement popular sovereignty, which is kind of what we talked about in the Compromise of 1850. The people in those areas should be able to decide whether or not they want slavery in their territories or not. Okay. Well, if you remember back to the Missouri Compromise, all that land, slavery had been banned in that area with the Missouri Compromise because that section of land was north of the 3630 parallel. Okay. So in order for this to happen, they have to repeal the Missouri Compromise. Okay. Well, pro slavery members obviously are for that because now they think they can, move people into those areas and establish slave states. Anti-slavery advocates are like, you know what? That's not right. Those have been free areas for years. It's not right to repeal this Missouri Compromise and make those areas slavery. Okay, so it's going to be debated, but eventually it is going to pass in 1854. As soon as it's passed, there's going to be pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates that are going to rush into Kansas as quickly as possible. They're both going to try to establish governments in Kansas. Okay. People from Missouri, pro-slavery supporters from Missouri, they were called border ruffians, are going to go into Kansas basically just to vote. Okay. The population of Kansas was only about 1,500 in the entire territory. When all the votes were counted, over 6,000 people had voted. Okay, so these border ruffians are going into Kansas, voting to help to try and set up and establish this pro-slavery government, and then they're just going back to Missouri. Okay, well, at the same time, anti-slavery members are establishing their own government in Kansas. So in 1856, you basically have two territorial governments in Kansas. You've got the anti-slavery government, you've got the pro-slavery government. That's going to lead to violence. Okay. In May of 1856, slavery supporters are going to go into Lawrence, Kansas, and basically attack anti-slavery supporters there in Lawrence, Kansas. An anti-slavery advocate, John Brown, is going to kind of get a group together, and he's going to go in and he's going to start killing pro-slavery members. So it's basically got this civil war in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery members. Newspaper editor will give it the term Bleeding Kansas. Okay. A lot of historians really say that here in 1856, this is the actual start of the Civil War. Okay. If you look anything up on Google or the internet or wherever, and you Google the dates of the Civil War, all of them are going to say 1861 to 1865. The official start of the Civil War, they say, was at Fort Sumter in South Carolina in 1861, April of 1861. There's a lot of historians say this is the actual beginning of the Civil War with this Bleeding Kansas, this Civil War in Kansas between the anti-slavery and the pro-slavery advocates. So just some pictures there. There's just this map I want to show you. The Compromise of 1850, which we talked about, the Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory. Slavery would be determined by popular sovereignty. Originally, the Nebraska and Kansas Territory, with the Missouri Compromise, slavery was outlawed, but with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, now this is going to be determined by popular sovereignty as well. Okay, and so then you can see the free states, the slave states, and just the sections of the country in 1854 after the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But these members will move into Kansas from Missouri. Two governments will be organized. Civil War will start there in Kansas, not the Civil War, but a Civil War, and then it'll just keep on boiling until the actual Civil War starts in 1861, which we will get to by the end of this chapter. Okay, so there's your Section 1 notes. Make sure you get those, copy those down, and you can use those on your test and be prepared for some more notes tomorrow.